All right, hey guys. So this week we are going to formally begin talking about the nervous system. So the last couple of weeks you had some activities that you did with videos. You watched the brain documentary to kind of give you an idea. This week we'll talk about the introductory, the functions of the nervous system, the divisions of the nervous system, the neuron, a little bit for getting through this part. Um, this week you'll have, so you should have read the couple of sections or at least skimmed the couple of sections in the textbook at this point. And today you'll watch this lecture, and then tomorrow you'll watch part two, where I'll go through all of this stuff. Wednesday, the quiz will open up on Mastering A&P. It's 20 questions on this material through Mastering A&P. And you'll have 35 minutes to complete the quiz once you start it. So make sure you're on a stable connection when you do that. And that quiz will be due by Friday at midnight. Okay. So whenever you're ready to take that quiz, you can do that. Just kind of make sure you're pacing yourself accordingly during the week. Okay. So let's get started. We'll talk a little bit about the basics of the nervous system. So your nervous system is like your endocrine system, which is the system that makes hormones. It's a control system of the body. So that means that it's going to essentially send messages out to other parts of the body and use those messages to elicit some kind of response. So this is a good figure here, and I don't think you have this on the PowerPoint you have, but I can send this out. When you look at your nervous system, there's two major parts to it. There's the central nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord, and that's where messages are going to be sent from or integrated. Talk about that. And then the messages sent out to all of the nerves, which come off, and that's the peripheral nervous system. So coming off of the spinal cord, coming off of the brain, we've got a whole bunch of nerves, and then those nerves are going to essentially send information out to the rest of the body. So it's going to send that information to the muscles, to glands, to ultimately elicit some kind of response. Okay. So just like when we've talked about maintaining homeostasis in the body and keeping that balance in the body, the nervous system is going to play a major role in regulating that homeostasis by interpreting data from the environment, external environment, internal environment, sending a message to ultimately elicit a response that will bring the body back to homeostasis. Now, how it does that, we'll talk about a little bit later through neurotransmitters, through action potentials, but we're not going to get into that too much. We would have been getting into that more if we were actually in school, but there is only so much we can do remotely, but we will get into as much of that as I think is necessary. So what are the major functions of the nervous system? So when we look at the nervous system, one of the things that it does is it gathers information. So sensory input is one of the major functions of the nervous system. So the nervous system can gather information from the external environment or from inside of your body. So for example, sensory input could be you put your hand on a hot stove. Okay, you put your hand on a hot stove, that sensory input of the stove being hot has to be sent from your hand to your brain to ultimately elicit a response. Okay, so you feel cold, that's sensory input. You feel hot, that's sensory input. You feel pain, that's sensory input. Again, that can be internal or external stimuli. So gathering information, monitoring changes inside and outside of the body. Those changes are stimuli. So any change that's going to ultimately elicit a response from the nervous system is a stimulus. Stimuli is plural of stimulus. The second step is integration. So now we have this sensory information, and what are we going to do with it? Well, your brain, your spinal cord have to now make sense of this information. Okay, so it's hot. What does that mean? Okay, so we process and we interpret sensory input, decide if there's some kind of action needed. So you've got to imagine this as like a pathway. Again, sticking with the stove example. You put your hand on the stove. Put your hand on the stove. Now messages are going to be sent upwards to the brain, to the spinal cord, telling your brain, telling your spinal cord, oh shoot, that's hot. Okay, hot is bad, pain is bad. I'm going to burn my hand, I'm going to cause serious damage. So what's your brain going to do? It's going to send information now back to the brain, back from the brain, the spinal cord, to the hand to lift up. Okay, so that response is, that motor output which usually is sent to skeletal muscle, sometimes smooth muscle if we're talking about things inside, is going to elicit a response to whatever that integrated stimulus was that we now understood as a problem. Okay? So it activates, like I said, either skeletal muscle or glands. Glands can be sweat glands or oil glands, depending on, again, what the stimulus is. If the stimulus is that it's really hot, it's going to activate your sweat glands in response to it, right? So this makes intuitive sense if you think about it. Sensory input gets sent to the brain to be integrated, and then the brain sends out an appropriate response to fix whatever the issue is. Okay, so this is all responding to a stimuli. And the nervous system does this all the time. All right, it does it in fractions of a nanosecond. Okay, so this slow process that I described, imagine that happening light speed. The sensory input, again, can be coming in from your eyes, it could be coming in from your ears, it could be coming in from your smells, right? All of these things come in, and then responses have to be integrated in the brain. And it's really amazing when you look at that. And for those of you that take A&P2 next year, you'll spend some time looking at how the senses work. So how we hear, how we smell, and then how those senses actually trigger responses in our brain is just absolutely incredible. So much so that a smell can trigger fire neurons that will trigger memories. So really amazing. So sensory input can be anything. Integrated in the brain if it's higher level, the spinal cord if it's a reflex. And then the brain and the spinal cord will elicit some kind of motor output. So you can think of this, for those of you that drive, you drive a car, you see a red light, right? Intuitively, red light doesn't mean anything to anybody that didn't learn it, but we learned that red light means stop. So your brain integrates that red light and says, okay, it's time to stop. What's the motor output is that you press on the brake. All right, so really amazing way in which we process the world. Okay, so that's essentially how what the nervous system does functionally. And if we classify the nervous system into kind of the different structures and functions, we can look at the central nervous system. And the central nervous system, like I said, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, all right? And now coming off of the brain, we've got cranial nerves. And then coming off of the spinal cord, we have spinal nerves. Now, there's 12 cranial nerves, 31 spinal nerves. You will in A&P2 again. We're getting, again, believe it or not, towards the end of this year, already thinking ahead to what you would be doing if you are a junior and you're going to take that course next year. The spinal cord has 31 pairs. The brain has 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they branch off into the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves that are branching out from the brain and the spinal cord. They're going to send information to and from the integrating centers of the brain and the spinal cord. Like I said, that's the spinal nerves and the cranial nerves. And you'll learn the cranial nerves next year. The spinal nerves, we don't do it, I don't believe. He does those in A&P2, but we do them at Rowan, and college you'll do the spinal nerves, but they're pretty easy. They just kind of match up where they are in the body, like brachial nerves and things like that. Okay, so this is a very important slide, okay? This is a very important slide because this is really the crux of the nervous system, okay? You need to understand this slide. You need to be able to kind of reproduce this. So I would suggest you, when we do over this, study it and then draw it out on your own. All right. So here's the nervous system as our whole thing. And then the nervous system can be broken up into two major groups, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's look at the central nervous system first because it's short, it's easy. The central nervous system contains your brain. What does the brain do? It receives, processes sensory information, instigates responses, stores memories, generates thoughts and emotions. So all the higher level information is going to be stored, related, and relayed to the body by the brain. The spinal cord is also an integrating center, part of the central nervous system. So the spinal cord runs down in between your vertebrae. So we learned about the vertebrae when we did bones way back a lifetime ago. It really does feel like a lifetime ago. But running down the center of those vertebral foramina is the spinal cord, which is this mass of nervous tissue, and it's you don't think with your spinal cord, it's all reflexes. You think with your brain. Okay, so that's the central nervous system. So everything coming off of it over here is the peripheral nervous system. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, again, it's all nerves coming off of it. So we're going to see there's different types of cells that make up the nervous system. So we've got motor neurons and we've got sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are going to contain the long branch of them, which is called the axon, which makes up nerves. Sensory neurons are going to send information from sensory organs to the central nervous system. So again, from your skin, from your eyes, from your ears to the central nervous system. So sensory neurons do that. Motor neurons are going to initiate the response to whatever the central nervous system elicits. These are the ones kind of going away from the central nervous system. Okay, so sensory neurons go towards the central nervous system. Motor neurons are sending messages away. So the motor neurons are going to send information that's going to elicit motion, right? So a motor neuron is going to send the signal right now that I'm sending to move my hand, right? That's being done by motor neurons, okay? Sensory neurons are what's taking in the information that's going to my eyes right now and telling my brain what to say and recalling memories that I have of how to teach this. All right, so really incredibly fascinating and fast how the nervous system works. So the motor neurons or the motor nervous system can be broken down into the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. Okay, so this right now, moving my arms, this is voluntary. So the motor neurons are part of the somatic nervous system. So anything that you consciously control, your skeletal muscle, is innervated by the somatic nervous system, right? The autonomic nervous system controls all of your body's involuntary responses. So the autonomic nervous system controls anything that you can't consciously control yourself. So here we're talking about things like digestion, things that are involving smooth muscle, right? So it's all autonomic or automatic, involuntary. So the sympathetic division, so we can take the autonomic nervous system and break it down into two types of involuntary responses. We've got the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system controls all of the things that are involved in your body's fight or flight response that's automatic, right? So if you see a bear and all of a sudden we need to divert lots of blood to our muscles to run away from the bear, that would be controlled by your sympathetic nervous system, right? And there's lots of examples of things that happen in your body between these two subsystems of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is hopefully what all of you guys have majorly kicked in right now. You're just sitting and watching and taking notes. So you're not in a state of over distress. Here you're in a state of distress and your body is allocating resources to that distress. Here you're just normal. You're resting, you're digesting, you're preparing. Okay, so parasympathetic really is the preparatory nervous system in that you're preparing maybe to fight or flight later on. But right now you're digesting your food, you're getting the nutrients from that food, you're sending blood evenly through your body. You're not in a state of stress. So think about things that start to happen as you get stressed. You feel major changes happening to your body. I'm not talking about stress like, oh, I have a test to study for. Like I'm talking about stress like a guy's chasing me with a knife. That's real distress. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the two types of stress. There's distress and there's eustress. Eustress is the stress that you might feel on a daily basis, right? That motivates you to do things. And that's good stress, all right? And sometimes we get confused and we think, oh, any stress is bad stress. And that's totally wrong, right? Nothing would get done if we didn't have stress, right? Stress is good. Distress is when you're in a situation where you are beyond that level of eustress, where you, again, someone's chasing you with a knife or you're about to foreclose on your house and your family's starving, things like that. That's distress. Okay, so don't let stress get in the way. Stress is a motivator, okay? But distress kicks in your sympathetic nervous system to either fight or flight, run away from something or fight it. And there's lots of sympathetic responses we have to things. So crying is a sympathetic response. Any kind of action that's going to be in response to something in the environment that could elicit a fight or flight response is sympathetic. So very interesting. Make sure you understand the difference between these two types of nervous system. I think there was a video we talked about in the first week. There was one about it. And make sure you go back and look at that section in your book because it is very important. So we can functionally classify the nervous system, and we can put some more names on these things. So we've got the sensory division, which we talked about, or the afferent division. So these are carrying information to the central nervous system. So afferent, anytime you see this, it means towards something. Towards the central nervous system is afferent nerves. And again, we're going to see afferent in other parts of the body too. So afferent arterioles take blood to the heart. So towards something. When we're going away from something or exiting, that's the efferent. So you can remember E for exit or efferent. So these are nerve fibers that are carrying impulses away from the central nervous system. Okay, so just this is another way that we could describe nerves by the direction in which they're going to. Okay. Remember that the somatic nervous system, like I said, is your voluntary nervous system, part of the efferent division, and the autonomic is your involuntary. Okay, so just summarizing kind of what was on the previous slide. Okay, so let's talk about what actually the histology looks like of the nervous system. So if we took a slice of the brain, we took a slice of the spinal cord, we took a slice of an area that was very nerve rich, we would see that nervous tissue looks like a whole bunch of spider webs. You've probably seen kind of pictures of that. So within those spider webs are two types of cells, neurons, which are the major workhorse of the nervous system, and neuroglial cells, which are the support cells. And there's lots of different types of neuroglial cells. We're not going to get into them, but the real major player is the neuron. Okay. So like I said, the support cells are the neuroglial cells, or neuroglia, and they support the central nervous system. They support the neuron. Here's a neuron. Notice how big the neuron is. Notice it's got all these branches coming off of it, right? And all of these little cells around it are neuroglial cells, and they have different functions to support the neuron. Okay, and this is just a look at any nervous system. So this could be a look at the brain cells. This could be a look at the spinal cord, right? Any area where we have nervous tissue. So like I said, let's function on the neuron, or let's focus on the neuron. So what is the neuron? So these are nerve cells, and their job is to transmit messages. Okay, that's their job. Neurons have a specialized structure. They have something called a cell body, and the cell body contains the nucleus and a large nucleolus, okay, the ribosome factory. Coming off of the cell body, there's projections that are called dendrites. And essentially, these dendrites are going to pick up messages from neighboring neurons and bring them into the cell body. I'll show you that in a second. The long tails that come off of the end of the cell body of a neuron are called axons. Okay, these conduct impulses from the cell body out to other neurons or out to the muscle cells that maybe they're going to. We talked about this already. We talked about the action potential comes down the somatic motor neuron to the muscle cell and sends the action potential that then triggers muscle contraction. We did that before, I think, for online learning. All right, so here's a look at the neuron itself. All right, good picture of it. So here is our cell body of the neuron, and the cell bodies are usually clustered up in the brain, up in the spinal cord, the central nervous system. And then coming off of the cell bodies of all the neurons, the millions and billions of neurons, are these axons. And these axons send messages, and they're all bundled together to make up nerves. All right. So our cell body is here. It's got the nucleus inside of it. It's got these structures called Nissl bodies, which are like endoplasmic reticulum. Here's the dendrites coming off, and these dendrites are going to take messages from a neighboring neuron that's here. Okay. Coming off, or there's lots of mitochondria. Coming off of the cell body, now we're getting into the axon hillock, which is the connection point between the cell body and the axon. And now notice that the axon is covered in these kind of pocket-looking things, right? These are called the myelin sheath, okay? And the myelin sheath is a wrapping around the axon. And the myelin sheath is made up of Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, but you don't need to know oligodendrocytes. Schwann cells, And these Schwann cells are going to be covering up the length of the axon, and there's spaces in between each of the Schwann cells, and those spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so essentially the purpose of these Schwann cells, this covering, this myelin sheath, is to increase the speed of transmission down this axon. So without this myelin sheath, it's basically like a wire that's not insulated, right? It's not going to be able to propagate an electrical signal. So all of the messages through the nervous system are sent through electrical signals called action potentials. So this action potential, this message would be generated down here, and these myelin sheath allow for that message to be sent much, much, much more quickly through the body than if they weren't there. And I always think about it in terms of, okay, we've got these spaces here, and the impulse essentially can jump spaces because of the myelin sheath. It's almost like if you were going across a document and you were hitting tab versus hitting spacebar. So the impulse is hitting tab, 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 whereas if we're hitting spacebar without these myelin sheath, it would move really slow. All right, so if you think about that, that's why the myelin really helps to speed up impulses. So impulses are going to move down the length of the axon of the neuron until they reach the axon terminal. And then what's going to happen here is neurotransmitters will be released that will then send the message to a neighboring cell. We've seen that already with muscles, right? The neurotransmitter acetylcholine will jump from the axon terminal to the cell. Okay, and there's tons of neurotransmitters that can be sent. Dopamine, there's serotonin, right? Again, we know acetylcholine already from muscle contraction, but not the only way neurotransmitters are sent. All right, so here's just another look under an electron microscope of what the neuron looks like with all of these projections coming off of it. So you want to recognize this figure and recognize what a neuron is, what its function is for your quiz. Just a simpler figure here for you to have. So axons end, like I said, in axon terminals or axonal terminals. These contain vesicles with neurotransmitters, which we've discussed, acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin. These are just a chemical message that's going to be sent from the neuron to another cell. So remember, the nervous system is all about sending information. The axon terminals are separated from the next neuron or the postsynaptic cell by a gap, which we talked about, that synaptic cleft or that synaptic gap. And that's where the neurotransmitters, are going to enter. Okay. Anytime you see a junction between nerves, it's called a synapse. Okay, so the junction is known as a synapse. The space is a synaptic cleft. All right, synapse just means to come together, right? So it's a junction between nerves. Covering the axons, like I said, is the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath functions to insulate and speed up the impulses, the action potentials that are going down the axon. So the cells that make up the myelin sheath, it's actually a cell that covers the length of the axon, multiple cells, called Schwann cells, and they kind of cover it up like a jelly roll. So if you were to slice it, you would see the axon is down the middle, and you've got sort of like a rings around it, and that's the myelin sheath, the Schwann cell wrapped around the axon. The gaps in the myelin sheath are known as the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, so here's that Schwann cell covering the axon. Like you can see, it's wrapping around. You can see the progression of it wrapping around. It does kind of take on that jelly roll appearance. Okay, so this is the axon. These are the Schwann cells, and they'd be separated by those nodes of Ranvier. So like I said, most of the cell bodies are concentrated in the central nervous system. That's not always the case, though. Specifically, excuse me, cell bodies that do not have myelinated fibers. So sometimes the cell body's fibers are unmyelinated. That's known as gray matter, and that's in the brain. And the gray matter is darker than the white matter, which has is just fibers. Nuclei are clusters of cell bodies within the white matter of the central nervous system. So when we call a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system a nuclei or a nucleus. That's a little confusing because we know the nucleus is like the control center of a single cell, but this is a same word for something different. So clusters of cell body in the central nervous system are called nuclei. So your brain is all full of these clusters of cell bodies called nuclei, and then coming off of them are nerve fibers. Collections of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are called ganglia. So occasionally we have these little ganglia, they're all over, clusters of cell bodies, tiny little integration centers out in the peripheral nervous system. So nuclei, cell bodies in the central nervous system, ganglia, cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So what are some of the functional properties of the neuron? Okay. Well, your neurons are irritable. That means that they can respond to stimuli. They can conduct electrical impulses. Okay, so irritability, conductivity. All right. We talked about this already. This might be a repeat slide. Yes, it is. It is a repeat slide, isn't it? Functional motor afferent. I guess this is just a little bit more information, but if we look here, right, or there's a little bit more here on this one. So if we look a little more closely at the sensory neurons, okay, they carry impulses from sensory receptors to the central nervous system, right? So an example of sensory afferent neurons are the cutaneous sense organs, okay? There's also sensors within our skin called proprioceptors, and these detect stress or tension, and then they'll send the information to the central nervous system. Our motor efferent neurons send impulses to the viscera, muscles, or glands. And interneurons are basically connecting different efferent and afferent pathways. Okay, so they're going to conduct both sensory and motor impulses. Right. So this picture is just showing you some of the different examples, right? So sensory neurons will detect, oh God, this is a horrific sight. But anyway, that message would be sent from the skin, the cutaneous, up towards the body, right? You can feel different textures as well. Okay, so feeling the tip of the paintbrush, right? Here you've got your detecting tension. Okay, you're pressing on something, there's proprioceptors. All right, and here you're lifting, you're engaging the muscle fibers, things like that. So lots of different examples in which sensory neurons are transmitting messages to the central nervous system. Okay, and this is just showing you a simplified image of what this would look like. So you've got dendrites picking up information. They're sending that through afferent pathways to be integrated in the spinal cord. Whoops. And then they're sending that information out by way of efferent motor neurons to effectors, glands, and muscles. Okay. So this is where I'm going to end with part one of the nervous system. So I hope that this helped you to understand some of the stuff you read in the book. And tomorrow I will release part two, finish this out, and then you can take your quiz. So feel free, if you have any questions about this material, to email me and I will help to clear anything up. Paying attention, and I will see you guys soon.